Okay, so now it's recording. Okay, so this is the next installment of this Style Intelligence training webinar. Again, my name is David Fass, and I'm the trainer at InetSoft. And today's topic is basically going to be about making selections or filtering in dashboards. So we've seen the basics. I assume that most of you who are listening to me now have probably built some dashboards, maybe simple dashboards, maybe advanced dashboards, and so you all know about various modes of selection, of doing filtering in dashboards. So I'm very quickly going to cover the basics, and then I'll try to introduce a couple of more interesting things that you might not know about. So as I always say, everybody is muted by default, so I can't hear you if you're trying to talk to me. So if you do want to talk to me, of course, I welcome questions. Just type your question in the chat box or in the question box, and it will pop up on my screen, and then I'll be able to reply. And since somebody is bound to ask, this recording that I'm making right now of this webinar will probably be available on Monday or Tuesday. Okay, so let's get started. And so in the background here, I have my portal up and running. And so what I'm going to do is open up Visual Composer, and I have a couple of simple dashboards that I already prepared, very simple dashboards. So open up Visual Composer here. Okay, and let me find the first one that I created. I called it Selections 1. And you'll be able to see in a moment that I'm not kidding when I said this was a simple dashboard. It's just a chart is all it is. Displays total versus state. Right? So nothing exceptional here. So what I want to first illustrate is just the basics of selections and dashboards. When you're designing a dashboard, the most common selection components that you have are going to be selection lists and range sliders. Right? Those are the kind of your go-to selection components, and they're easy enough to add. So for example, if I want the user to be able to select a set of states to see in the chart, then what I can do is just find that state field in my data block here. This actually should not be there. That was from something I was trying earlier. So I can find that state field and just drag it into the dashboard. That gives me a selection component. So just like that, and then I can go ahead and I can select states. And I'm sure that we've done this before in previous webinars, so I'm not going to discuss too much about that kind of basic approach. And then the other most familiar kind of selection component is a range slider, and a range slider allows you to select a range of dates or a range of numbers, right? So an example of selecting a range of dates would be if you have a date field. I'm just adjusting something here. Okay, hopefully that's a little better. If you have a date field, you can drag that in. That gives you a range slider, just like this, and you can select a range of dates just by dragging those handles, and that's a typical way to select ranges of dates. And obviously you can see that the chart is updating as I make those different selections. It's a similar thing for numerical fields. So if I delete that range slider and instead, let's say, choose quantity purchased and drag that in, that's a numerical field. Right? And so again, I get a range slider, and I can now select which orders do I want to look at in this chart. For example, right now I'm selecting that I want to look at orders that had between 5 and 10 items purchased on the order, right? And that's the results that I'm looking at here. So again, these are just some of the most basic approaches. So before we go further, let me just illustrate that there are some properties that you can set even for these basic approaches. For example, if we let's get back our selection list here. So here's our selection list. And if you go into the properties for the selection list, there's a number of different things that you can set here. Some of these we've probably looked at before. For example, you can set the way that it's sorted. You can select whether it should submit on change, or whether, if you turn that off, for example, whether there should be an apply button there. See that green apply button? So that green apply button is only there if you turn off that option to submit on change. Right? If I go back into the properties and turn that option back on, then that apply button disappears. Right? Then There's also an option for single selection, and this is basically in instances where you want to force the user to select just one item. So rather than selecting a subset, you want them to select just strictly one item, you can choose a single selection. And then there's also an option for a drop down here. And basically this just, it allows you to collapse that selection list to a single bar, right? So if you're in a tight space situation when you're designing your dashboard, right, you can do that, and then your selection list is going to end up looking like this, right? It's just the title bar, and when the user clicks on it, right, clicks on that little expand button there, then they can make their selections, and then you can collapse it back up. So those are just some of the basic options for selection lists. Now there's a more interesting option here that I want to illustrate to you. So again, I'm going to go back into the properties for the selection list, and I'm going to go to the Data tab this time. And what you have under the Data tab is, first of all, you can, if you need to change the field that is being selected, like right now I have the category field, the selection list is filtering the category field. If I need to change that, for example, to the name field or something like that, I could do it from the Data tab. But what I want to illustrate to you down here is that you can also display a measure on the selection list itself, right? So for example, let's say next to each of these categories, I want to display the average quantity purchased for orders in that category. So I can select here quantity purchased, and then as the aggregation, oh, it doesn't have average. Good one. Okay, so let's say I want to display the sum of quantity purchased. Okay, so for each of these categories, I want to display the sum of quantity purchased. I would just set things up like this, and then I can choose whether I want to see that aggregated value either as text or as a bar or as both. So in this case, I'll choose both, press OK. And then what you get is a slight variation on what we've seen so far. Let's see if I can, oh, I still have this as a collapsing. Let me set this back to a normal style. Where did I set that? Over here. Okay, and so this is basically what you end up with. You get your list of items that you can select, and then next to each of those items, we have the aggregated value displayed as text and the aggregated value displayed as a bar. And again, you can choose whether you want the bar or the text or both. And so that's an interesting little twist. Now, as far as range sliders go, of course, they also have some properties. So if you have a range slider and you right-click on it, go to Properties, there are, under the Advanced tab, there's a number of different things you can set, some aspects that control the appearance. You can set the minimum and the maximum and the slider size. But the thing that I wanted to show you here that might not be obvious at first is that if you right-click on the range slider, there's also an edit option. Right? And this edit option basically allows you, as the designer and also as the user, to type in the values that you want. Right? So if you select edit, then you get a from and a to, and basically this is a way to numerically specify the range. Now, why would you need to do that? Well, in a lot of cases, if you have a range slider that's selecting, let's say, very large range of values, let's say 0 to 10 million, with some increment, some small increment, a lot of times that can be difficult to select exactly what you want by dragging the N handles. It just, it's because there's only so much resolution on the screen, right? You're trying to drag it back and forth and you can't quite get the number that you're after, right? So what you can do is you can just right-click, select edit, and then just enter the from and the to values here, and you don't have to worry about dragging the handles. Okay, so those are just some basic aspects of selection. Probably many of those you've been familiar with already. The other selection item that is commonly used is a selection tree and also calendar. So before we get to a selection tree, let's talk a little bit about calendar. Right, calendar is a way similar to a range slider. Right, again, a range slider can select a range of dates. A calendar component can also select a range of dates, but it gives you more control over that selection. So a range slider is just, it's a fairly simple interface, right? You get a start point and a to point, and you basically select some continuous range in between. Let's see what a calendar gives you. So I'm going to look over here, and see if I can find a calendar component. Here it is, calendar, drag that in. And there's a number of different things you can do with the calendar. The first thing that you need to do is you need to actually associate the calendar with a particular date field. Right, so this calendar right now doesn't do anything of interest because it's not associated with any date field. So what I'll do is I'll find the date field that I want to filter, grab that field, drag it onto the calendar. Now this calendar is going to act as a filter on that date field, just like we had before with the range slider. And this is the default appearance of the calendar. And in the default view of the calendar, I can select weeks. Right, so you'll notice that I'm selecting different weeks of December 2014. If I hold down the Control key, I can select discontiguous weeks, right? So I can select, let's say, the first week and the, what would that be, the fourth week of December 2014, right? So that means that the data that I'm looking at in the chart is the aggregated data from just those 2 weeks, just the first week and the fourth week of December 2014. So you can see already that you can do stuff with a calendar that you cannot really do with a range slider. There's no way to do that, to select 2 discontiguous weeks with a range slider. Now, calendars have a bunch of different views, so let's take a look at some of the other options for calendar. So there are these 3 buttons up here in the little toolbar. The first button is switch to year view, and if you click that, then basically it'll take you from displaying the days of the month to displaying the months of the year. Right? And so this allows you to select, for example, a month at a time, right? And you can also select discontiguous months, again, by holding down the Control key. Right, so here I've selected February 2014 and November 2014, and that's the data that I'm seeing in the chart, is the aggregated data from those 2 months. Okay, so going beyond that, there's another button here called Switch to Range/Comparison, and basically what that gives you is a 2-page calendar. Right, so now I've got 2 pages, and I can select 2 different years, for example, by using the little arrow controls, the little triangle over here and over here. I can page and over here as well. I can page back and forth through the years, and that allows me to select, for example, November 2013 through March of 2014, that type of thing. When you have the 2-page calendar, you also have this apply button here. So the 1-page calendar applies immediately as soon as you make the selection. The 2-page calendar, you have this apply button, and you have to press that apply button to get the selection to apply. Okay, so those are just some of the basic things that you can do with a calendar. Of course, you can also you can put this back to the original view where you see the individual days, and you can have a 2-page calendar that allows you to do selection that way. And there's also, if we go to the properties, there are a few settings of interest, but the one that I want to point out is this option here called day selection. Right, so if selecting week by week is not high enough resolution. Oh, there's a question. Hold on a moment. There was a question from Jim, which was a few minutes ago. I didn't catch it, sorry. Can you sort a selection list by the value shown? Interesting. In other words, by the aggregated value. Let's take a look at that in a moment. I don't know offhand, but we'll take a look. But let me just finish what I was saying about the calendar. So if selecting week by week is not high enough resolution for you, you can do day selection as well, and then press OK, and that allows you to select day by day as well as week by week. And you can also, well, you should be able to, let me see if I can, should be able to select all the Fridays. Maybe I can only do that if I'm in a 1-page view. Right, so if I'm in the 1-page view, I can actually select, in addition to selecting days or weeks, I can select, for example, all the Thursdays in a month or something like that. Okay, let me show you one more thing with regard to the calendars. I'll put this back to the view that we had before, which is the 2 years side by side. And I want to illustrate that you can also use a calendar for comparisons in addition to just selecting ranges. And the way you do that is by pressing this button here. There's a button called Switch to Comparison Mode. You do that. And then what's going to happen is you can make a selection on one side of the calendar, let's say January 2013, make a selection on the other side of the calendar, which in this case I've selected January 2014. Right? And basically what this indicates is that I want to do a comparison between January 2013 and January 2014. press the apply button, and then the comparison takes place in any charts or crosstabs that you have in the dashboard. So the comparison that you set up in the calendar is basically pushed into any charts and pushed into any crosstabs that you have. It's a very easy way to do comparisons between different months or different weeks and so on. Okay, so that's a quick look at calendars. So let's take a look then at the last of the selection items. Oh, before we do that, let me get to Jim's question. So Jim had asked if we have a selection list. So let's say, as we did earlier here. And if we set this up to have a value. Now the question is, can we sort the selection list on that value? So let's say we have something like this. This is pretty much what we had earlier. Now, can I sort these items in the selection list by those values? Let's see. Now, there is a sort feature, but these ascending and descending sort, I believe, will only, these are just strictly alphabetical to my knowledge. So if I do ascending, then I should get, well, that's interesting. Maybe it changes based on whether you have, so wait a second, let's say I turn that off for a moment. Let me put this back to none. Okay, so now it's alphabetical, and if I do a descending sort, reverse alphabetical, but now if I go ahead and add in, right now if I set this up like I did before, quantity purchased, some aggregation. Okay, and now it's set. It's still set to descending, so now it's descending by value. And if I switch this to ascending, now it's ascending by value. So that's the answer. It will, if you choose ascending or descending, and you also choose to display a measure, then it will use the measure to apply that sorting. So I did not know that, but now I do. Okay, Jim has another question. In the case of something, does that data export the sort is alpha? Jim, could you type that again? I think that got a bit garbled. Ignore that one. Okay. That's good because I can't read it. So okay, so I'm going to delete that. And let's move on to the last of the selection items, the last of the major selection items. So we looked at selection list, range slider, and calendar. We'll talk a little bit about selection container next. But before we do, let's just talk about selection tree. And selection tree is, again, you're probably all familiar with the basics of it. It allows you to select values at different levels of hierarchy. So a common thing would be something like state and city. Or any other example of items that form a nested hierarchy, right? So obviously states and cities, certainly form a hierarchy. So this is the basics of a selection tree, and other than that, there's nothing really remarkable about it. You can select at the state level, and you can select at the city level. Right, but the thing that you'll notice is that because on the chart, right, the chart is set up so that I have the state field on the x-axis, even if I select at the city level, right, so let me clear this out, and let's say that I decided I want to select particular cities like San Francisco, you'll notice that the chart still displays it by state, right, and that's not an error. That's because that's the way the chart is set up. If I open up the chart editor, you can see that I have the state field here on the x-axis, so it is correctly displaying the state on the x-axis. But sometimes what you might want to do is if you select at the city level here, like I've just done, you might want the chart to switch the x-axis to display the cities. And there's actually an easy way to do that. So let me just illustrate that again as just an example of a little twist on things. So I've got my selection tree. I'm going to clear that out. And what I'm going to do here is instead of having this be fixed, the x-axis of the chart be fixed to state, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a property of the selection tree that's called drill member. right? And the drill member property basically returns the level at which the selection is made. Right, so let's just see how this works. You can, if you want to get the details on it, you can consult the documentation. But I just want to show you, what the effect is. So I'm going to switch, instead of having state here, I'm going to switch this to expression, right? And I'm going to set the field that's used on the x-axis by using the drill member property of the selection tree. So I'm going to press the edit button here, and if you look in the, if you're writing an expression for a property, you get this list of components. So I can look at the components. Here's the selection tree component, and among the properties that are available in that selection tree component, there's a property called drill member. There's also one called drill members that I'm not going to talk about right now, but the one that I'm looking at right now is drill member, and so I can just click that. And that's my script. That's basically it. Basically what I'm saying is I want the field that's displayed on the x-axis to be set by the drill member property of the selection tree. And basically that will change depending on what kind of selections I make in the selection tree. It will either return state or city. So let's take a look at how that works. Right? So there again, that's the entire script that I've written that's being used to set the field on the x-axis. And now if I clear out the selection list, and let's say I select at the state level, interesting. You know what, let me see if I can get a little bit of a deeper hierarchy here. Let me add one more thing in, because I see now it's switched to city, but... All right, so if I don't select anything, then I see the states. As soon as I make a selection, then it goes to city. Let me see, I think this might be a little bit more obvious what's going on here if I add in another level here. So let's say if I go here and I find region, so region, state, city are now my levels. Incidentally, you can also do display a measure in a selection tree like you do for a selection list. Those controls are down here. So let's see what happens here. If I make a selection here, all right, so basically what the drill member property is doing is it returns the name of the field that's one level below where you select. So if I select a region, then it displays the states. I see there's a question. I'll check it out in just a second. So if I select the region, then it displays the states. If I select a state, then it displays the city level. Right, and if I select select something at the city level, then again it displays the city level. Okay, so basically the drill member property returns the name of the field that's one level below the field at which you made the selection, and in many cases that's the kind of behavior that you want in this kind of case. Okay, let me check the question box here. I'm frozen. Okay, everybody's telling me that I'm frozen. Am I still frozen? Could somebody tell me if I'm still frozen? Slightly frozen. Looks good to me. Okay, so chilled a bit. Okay. All right. Well, I'll assume that I'm not frozen right now. So I don't know at which point I froze. But what I was illustrating, again, just to, I apologize if this is repetitious, but I was illustrating that you can use this property of a selection tree to return a field that's appropriate to the selections that you've made in the selection tree. Again, the drill member property itself will return the field name that's one level down from where you made your selection. So if you made a selection in this case, at the level of region, then it returns the state field, which will be used on the x-axis. If you make a selection at the state level, it will return the city level that will be used. And if you make a selection at the city level, it will also return the city field that will be used on the x-axis. So that's just an interesting little twist. Okay, let's move on to something else, which is, I think, the last of the. Oh yeah, let me switch this back. I'll put that back to state. Okay, the last of the selection items is this thing called a selection container. Right, and this has a few different roles. One role, and some of these we've seen previously, I'm pretty sure, in examples that we've done earlier in this series. So a selection container, first of all, you can use it just to display any current selections that have been made. So let's say that we do have some selection elements like a category selection list and a date range slider, and let's say also a maybe a state selection list. Okay, so let's say we have all these different selection components that we've built in our dashboard, and let's say that we wanted to provide a single place that a user could look to find out what are the current filters that are in place on their data, right? So they're looking at a chart, or more likely a set of charts, set of crosstabs, set of tables. They've got a whole bunch of selection elements, and when they're looking at this chart, they just want to be able to look in one place and see, okay, what filters are on there, right? So obviously one way that they could approach that is they can look across the entire dashboard, and look at all of these selection lists, look at all the range sliders, look at all the calendars, and so on and so forth. And just by scanning across the entire dashboard, they can figure out what are the filters that are currently in place. But perhaps a slightly easier approach is to add a selection container. And then among the selection container properties, if you go to properties, there's an option to show current selections. And basically what that option will do is it will use the selection container to display the current selections that have been made in any selection components that are on the dashboard. So if you're making some selections of state and category and so on, oops. Right, so you're making some selections of a date range. You'll notice that in the selection container, it's basically accumulating all of that information, all of those filters that you've applied, and it's displaying it right here. So rather than have to look across the entire dashboard to figure out what filters are in effect, the user can just look in this one place, and they can see that, for this particular view that I'm looking at right now, I'm looking at the following categories, the following date range, and the following states. Right, so that's one role of a selection container. Another role of a selection container is actually as a host for selection elements. So you can actually, when you're building your dashboard, if you're pressed for space, what you can do is you can use a selection container simply to hold the various selection elements that you add. So you can add some range sliders and some selection lists and so on. Right, you can add all those things into the selection container, and that basically gives you a very compact way to include a lot of filtering items in a dashboard without consuming a lot of space, and the user can then expand and collapse those different selection items as needed. Okay, now there's one other thing of interest that you can do with a selection container, so let me, let's get rid of these guys so I can illustrate. Okay, so now I'm back to an empty selection container. Now the other thing that you can do with a selection container is it allows the user to be able to use a right-click filter option for charts and for tables. So let me illustrate on the chart. Right, so if I do a preview here, right, so this is the dashboard the way the user would see it in the preview. Right, so if I have a selection container here, what the user can do is they can right-click on the chart, and there's going to be a filter option there, right? So if you select filter, right, that basically pops up kind of an ad hoc filter that allows the user to filter the chart, right? Now the reason you need the selection container is because when the user is done with that filter, then basically it's going to go away, right? So the only way, interesting that it shows that twice, right, so the only way the user knows what the filter in effect currently is by looking in the selection container, because it's not going to hang around on the chart, and if they want to clear it, they can clear out the selection container. That's interesting. Might be a bug there. But anyway, so that works. That right-click filter option works for charts, and I believe also for tables. So if I add a table here, I'm just adding a table by dragging in the entire data block, right, and then I do a preview of this guy. All right, so the user again can, if they want to filter on any of these columns, let's say they want to filter on the company, right? They only want to see particular companies. They can right-click on that column. There's going to be a filter option there, and that will pop up an ad hoc selection list, and they can make their filtering choices. Right? So they can select certain companies, right? And then again, when they click away, that disappears, but the values that they selected are displayed in the selection container. So the reason that you might want to do this is that it saves you from adding a whole bunch of different selection elements, right? Because if you didn't do it this way, and you wanted the user to be able to filter the chart on, or filter the table on any of these fields, then you would have to add selection elements for each of these fields. You'd have to add a selection list for region, selection list for city, selection list for state, and on, right? So you'd fill up half of your dashboard with selection elements, but by doing it this way, by adding a selection container and then relying on the right-click filter menu, you can basically give the user the ability to make all those selections without adding all of those individual selection components into the dashboard. Okay, so that's those are some of the basics and a little bit of advanced stuff. Let's take a look at a few more topics before we wrap up. Time goes quickly. So I'm going to delete this and delete this. Let's take a look at synchronization. That's an important part of using filters, because there are cases when you're building composite dashboards, or when you're building dashboards with elements that pull data from different data blocks, there are instances where you will need to synchronize your filters, right? So let's take a look at an example of this. I'll leave this dashboard open here. Maybe I'll come back to it if there's time, but let me, in the meantime, open a different one. Selections 2. And this dashboard is different than the other one in that if you take a look at the underlying worksheet here, right, this is the dashboard that's built on a worksheet, you can see that it has several data blocks. It has a data block that contains some order information. It contains a data block that a data block that contains some return information about returned orders. And then, so this is the order information, return information, and then the top one is orders and returns, right? Now, of course, one approach to building a dashboard is to create an underlying data block that has all of the data that you need. And in fact, that's what this worksheet that's being used by the dashboard actually does by creating that orders and returns data block. But there are cases where you don't have that in the underlying data worksheet. You don't have the mashup that you want, and you might be building your components based off of different data blocks. And so that's what I've done here to illustrate. Right, so I have this chart at the top here. If you look down at the toolbar, you can see that that's based on the order information data block. So that's pulling data from the order information data block. The other chart down here is pulling data from the return information data block. So these two charts are bound to two different data blocks. Now, let's say that I wanted the user to be able to filter on the product name, right? So you can see on the x-axis I have the product names. Right, so what I could do here is for the top chart, I can drag in should be, I guess it's the product field here. Drag in product. That should give me the product names. Right, and that that's the way that I would typically add a filter, and the user can then go ahead and select whatever products they want to look at in the chart, and that works entirely as expected. The problem is though that the bottom chart is not being filtered, right? Because this product selection list that I added is filtering only the order information data block, right? That's the data block from which I took that field, right? The product field that I have that's basically populating this selection list is the product field from the order information data block, so that's the data block that it's filtering, right? And that's why it's not filtering the bottom table. So what I would then need to do if I wanted to give the user the ability to filter also the bottom table is I would need to get another selection list, right? So I would need to go to the return information data block, grab the product field there, drag it over here, right? And so now I've got another selection list that filters the bottom table, the bottom chart, right? So everything works. It's just very clunky because I've got it's basically the same selection list, one that's filtering the top chart, one that's filtering the bottom chart. So that's not very user-friendly. What I would want to do is I would want to somehow synchronize these two guys. And although this situation that I'm illustrating here is not that common, because generally if you have, if you have a worksheet that you're using, then probably you've already mashed up all the data in the worksheet, so you don't really need to pull data from those two different data blocks. But this situation will arise more commonly when you're building composite dashboards by embedding one dashboard in another dashboard. Right? In that case, it's very common to have to synchronize selection elements like what I'm showing you here. Right? So how do you do it? How do you synchronize these two guys? It's pretty simple. You go up to the Options button, and there's a tab over here called Filters. Right? And this is where you set up shared filters. And basically, all you have to do is you just have to give these two selection lists the same ID. Right? And any selection elements that have the same ID will be automatically synchronized. So I'm going to add selection list 1, and I'll just call it product. Right? And then I'm going to add selection list 2, and I'm going to give that the same ID, product. Okay? And that's the key thing, right? They both have the same ID, and because of that, they're going to be synchronized. So I can press OK. Right? And so now what you'll notice is that when I make selections in the top selection list, those are propagated to the bottom selection list, and when I make selections in the bottom selection list, those are propagated to the top selection list. And therefore, I only need to make one selection in one of these selection lists, and both of the charts are filtered. So obviously, what that means is that I no longer need both of these selection lists. So what I can do is I can hide one of these guys. Let's see if this will work. If I just go to Visible and do Hide, hopefully that will still work. And it does. Okay. So now this bottom selection list is invisible, right, if I do a preview. Okay. So I only see the one selection list, but invisibly behind the scenes, I know that there is that other selection list here, and as I make choices in this top selection list, those choices are being propagated to the bottom selection list, which is filtering the bottom chart. But as far as the user knows, there's just this one selection list that's filtering both charts. Okay, so that's basically the concept of shared filters. All right, let's see if we can look at one last concept here. Let me see which one I want to do. I'm just scanning the list. Okay. Okay. The last thing that I want to do here is just illustrate, kind of a variation, a more advanced variation on this. Let's say that you have a situation where you want the user to be able to select dates. So let me go back. Let me go back to the our original dashboard here, a very simple one. All right, and what you'd like to do is you'd like the user to be able to select a range of dates, and we know, of course, that you can, select ranges using a range slider. There are other ways to select dates. Also, obviously, calendar was another approach to select dates. And in fact, if you wanted to create a selection list with dates, you could do that as well, right? You can add a selection list and then drag a date field into the selection list, and it gives you a little warning, but you can say OK, and then that gives you a selection list to select dates. And if that's not entirely what you want, then there are even other approaches. For example, let's say that you wanted the user to select just one of the 4 years that are in the data set, right? So you don't want them to select months. You don't want them to select weeks, right? So one way to do that would be to use a calendar. Right, so using a calendar, the user could select an entire year at a time by clicking on the year. But let's say that you wanted to give them a list of just the 4 years, right? So now you're scratching your head. How do you do that? How do you create just a list of the 4 years? Well, probably the easiest way to do that is just to create a calculated field. All right, so let me show you this first. If you just right-click on the data block, there's an option there called New Calculated Field. Right, and it gives you an option, detail versus aggregate. This is going to be a detail calculation because it's the computation of the year is going to be based on the detail data in the data block. And so I'll just create a new field, and I'll just call it year. Press OK. And then basically what I want to do is I just want to, let me switch this to JavaScript. Right, so I can write a JavaScript expression that uses a property called calc.year, right? So this is just a JavaScript function, calc.year, and that will give me the year of any date that I give it, right? And so the date that I want to give it is the date in the date field, right? So the date field is the date field in the data block, right? So I'm taking that date field, and calc.year will just give me back the year. So this expression here, this very simple expression, will just give me a new field that just contains the year corresponding to each of the dates in the date field, right? So if I press OK, right, that gives me this new calculated field here, and then I can simply use this field in a selection list, for example. Okay. So there's the 4 years. I can select a year, and it should behave as expected, right? So now I'm looking, depending on what years I select, I'm looking at the data only for those years. So that's one approach to handling that situation where none of the available fields and none of the available selection elements gets you what you want. You can always try to address that by creating a calculated field and then using that field as your selection element. Let me show you one other approach to this. If this doesn't address your needs, then there is another approach that requires a bit more script, but it's also very flexible. So let's take a look at it. Let's say that I wanted the user to choose between two options, such as last year and 2 years ago. Right? Now, obviously, I don't have any field here that gives me just that. Although I probably could create a calculated field that would based on the date, right? So I could have a new field called period, and that field would either have a value of last year or 2 years ago based on the date. I'd have to do a little scripting to get that. I could also write that script at the worksheet level. So those are certainly valid approaches, but I want to show you another approach here. So let's say that we wanted this kind of interface. I'm going to add a radio button here, and I wanted the user to be able to select from two options in the radio button. The first one is, let's say something like last year, value last year. And the next one would say 2 years ago. Okay, so this is basically the kind of interface that I'm contemplating here. I want the user to be able to make this choice, right? And then the chart I want to update. Now, how do I handle this kind of thing, right? So how do I process this radio button? What I can do is I can actually put a condition on the chart that uses the values submitted in this radio button to filter the chart. So I'm just going to illustrate this very quickly because I know that I'm running short on time. Let's see if I can see how quickly I can do this. So I'm going to add a condition here, right? So a chart has a condition property. Other components also have condition properties. And I'm going to write a little script here that says something like this. Date is between, right? And rather than entering some fixed dates here, I'm going to use expression. And I want these to be JavaScript expressions. Right? And so I need a start date. So first of all, what I'd like to do is I'd like to define a couple of variables. So I need to find out what is last year and what is 2 years ago. So I'll create a variable called last year. And basically what I can do here is I can start with today's date. Right? So there's a function called calc.today that gives me today's date. And then what I want to do is I want to subtract a year from that. So there's a property called dateAdd. Right? And dateAdd takes either some designation of the interval that you want to count in terms of. If I want to count in terms of years, it's y, and -1 means count 1 year into the past. Right, so basically I'm taking today's date, I'm going back a year, and then I just want to strip off the year part of that. So we already know that there's a function called calc.year. Right. Now there are many ways to write this kind of script. This is just a way that popped into my head. So, hopefully this will work, but there are other ways to do it. So last year is given to me by this expression, right? And obviously it should give me back 2014, right? And then I'm going to create another variable called 2 years ago. And I'm just going to borrow this over here because basically what I want to do is I just want to subtract 2, right? So rather than going 1 year into the past, I'm going to go 2 years into the past, and then I'm asking for the year part of that. Right, so that gives me, now I know last year and I know 2 years ago. And then basically what I want to do is I want to write a little conditional statement here that will look at the selection that the user made in the radio button. So I'll say if radio button dot selected object, right, that gives me the value that the user selected in the radio button. If the user selected last year, then what I want to return here is a date, which is basically January of last year, right? That's going to be the starting date in that case. So if the user selected last year, then I'm going to return new date, and the year is going to be last year, and then January and first, right? So this, the new date function, this is basically the constructor for a new date object. There are many ways to use this constructor, but one way is to give it the year, the month starting from 0, and the day, right? So I'm giving it last year, which should be 2014. 0 means January, 1 means the first. And then I'll say else, right? So that's if the user selected last year. If they selected something else, which means that they selected 2 years ago, then what I want to return is a new date, right? And the year this time is going to be 2 years ago, comma 0, pardon me, comma 1, January 1st, 2 years ago. Okay, so this is the little script, assuming that I didn't make any syntax errors. This should set my start date, right? And I'm just going to copy this because I'll need some of this also to set the end date. So I'm going to copy that, right? So that's my little script to set the start date. Then going to, I need to set the end date. So again, last year, 2 years ago, I'm going to keep this part. And then I'm going to say if the user selected last year, then the end date is going to be December, right? That's index 11, because again, we're counting from 0, December 31st of last year. Otherwise, it's going to be December 31st of 2 years ago. Okay. So, you know, if you're not that familiar with scripting, obviously this is, you know, going to go over your head to some extent. But my point here is to illustrate that there are ways to get beyond any limitations that you have when you're building a dashboard, any limitations that you find in how you're able to select and filter the dashboard. There are ways to go beyond that, and this is one such way, by using input components and then by scripting the condition that's placed on a component such as a chart or a table. So this is it. This is the condition that I've added. Let's see if it works. All right. There's an error. Radio button 1 is not defined. Well, that's interesting. Clearly, it exists. Radio button 1 is not defined. Well, let's see where the error is. How can radio button 1 not be defined? Well, that I don't understand. I'm going to have to look into that. I did test this out earlier today, and and it did work at that time. But I don't want to hang everybody up just for my debugging purposes. So, so obviously there seems to be a problem somewhere in my script. But I'm gonna call it a day there, and I'll just ask for questions. This should work pretty much the way I did it, but obviously there's an issue. But we'll leave it there. Any questions on anything that we covered today? Okay, doesn't sound like. While I'm waiting for questions, I'll just keep looking at the script to see if there is a genuine problem. Well, I don't see it just looking at it. How can radio button 1 not be defined? It's right there. Well, that's interesting. So I just did a preview, and it works in the preview. Right, so here's, so I'm making a selection of last year. I'm looking at last year's data. I make a selection of 2 years ago. I'm looking at data from 2 years ago. So it does work. I don't know why in the design view why it's throwing that error, but basically, what it's doing is it's looking, the condition that I have on the chart is looking at the selection that I'm making over here, and it's filtering the chart based on that choice, right? It's setting the start date and end date based on the choice that I make here. Okay, well, that seems like a happier ending. I'll stay online for one more minute just to see if there's any questions, but if not, then hope you all have a nice weekend, and hope to see you back next month for the next exciting installment. And I'll hang on the line here for a few more minutes. Otherwise, take care, everyone. Okie doke. Have a good weekend, everyone.